At Thanksgiving dinner, my cousin Brittany Monroe stood up like she was about to accept an Oscar. She tapped her wine glass with a manicured nail, sending a sharp chime through the room, and beamed as if this was her moment of glory. Family meeting, everybody, she announced, her voice sweet but soaked in fake charm. Then, with a grin that could slice glass, she said, "We took a vote. And Rachel, you're officially out. You're no longer part of this family." For a split second, my brain refused to process her words. I let out a small, awkward chuckle, glancing around, waiting for the punchline for someone to say, "Just kidding." But the silence that followed was razor thin, and then it shattered into loud, genuine laughter. Real belly-deep laughter that had nothing to do with me being in on the joke. Cousins, aunts. Even Uncle David, with his ever-present beer belly and half-smirk, joined in slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Someone hollered group selfie, and suddenly chairs scraped against the hardwood floor, as everyone scrambled together, arms draped around each other, heads pressed close, faces lit up with wide grins. Phones were raised, angles were checked, and one thing was crystal clear: they made sure I wasn't in a single shot. Not even accidentally. I stood frozen still, holding my flimsy paper plate, where a half-eaten slice of pumpkin pie wobbled dangerously with my trembling hands. My fingers gripped the edges so tightly the plate bent inward. I stared at them, my so-called family, and not a single person met my eyes. It was like I wasn't even there. Slowly, quietly, I set my plate down on the side table, barely making a sound, as if trying not to disturb their picture-perfect moment. My chest felt tight, each breath shallow and sharp. With my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, I turned toward the front door. One step, then another, like my body was moving on autopilot, just trying to get out before the dam burst. I whispered to myself, "It's fine. You're fine. You knew this would happen." But that was a lie. It wasn't fine. It wasn't even close. I was halfway to the door, my coat just within reach, when a deep, unwavering voice cut through the noise like a hot knife through butter. "Rachel, sit down." The words stopped me dead in my tracks. For a moment, the room held its breath. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laughter died abruptly, leaving a heavy ringing silence behind. I turned slowly, my hand hovering inches from the doorknob. There, rising carefully from his chair by the fireplace, was Grandpa Walter Monroe. His movements were slower these days, more deliberate, but the weight of his presence was impossible to ignore. Dressed in his usual dark slacks and a burgundy cardigan that made him look every bit the family patriarch, he reached for the old karaoke microphone we'd used earlier for embarrassing sing-alongs and Christmas carols. But this wasn't a game now. His gaze swept the room, not the soft, indulgent look of a doting grandfather, but sharp and cutting, like he was seeing every single person for who they really were. For a beat, no one moved, no one dared. And then Grandpa Walter spoke again. His voice was calm, but beneath it was a steel edge none of us had heard in years. What he said next didn't just change the mood. It didn't just change Thanksgiving. It changed my life forever. And if you've ever found yourself in a moment like that, where one unexpected truth cracked open the way you see the world, then you'll understand why sharing stories like these matters. If this resonates with you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Not just for me, but so more people can find their own reminder that belonging isn't something you earn, it's something you claim. Thanksgiving had always been a peculiar sort of holiday for me, an occasion draped in the illusion of warmth and belonging, yet somehow colder than all the others. In theory, it was meant to be about family, about gathering around a table to give thanks for each other, to feel rooted, connected. But for as long as I could remember, stepping into Uncle David Monroe's sprawling lake house each November had felt less like a homecoming and more like stumbling onto a stage where the script was written in a language I had never learned. That year, the house was suffocatingly full. Every corner pulsed with life, every room thrummed with noise so loud it seemed to reverberate through my bones. The air was thick with the scents of roasted turkey, spiced yams, cinnamon-laced apples, and the unmistakable undertone of cheap wine breathing from half-empty glasses. Somewhere in the basement, a chorus of children's shrieks rose and fell like a chaotic symphony, while the adults' laughter upstairs erupted in boozy bursts, each louder and more performative than the last. I lingered by the front door, my fingers gripping the flimsy aluminum pie tin like it was a lifeline. A store-bought pumpkin pie, barely cooled, clutched awkwardly in my hands, as if that sad, plastic-wrapped dessert could bridge the chasm between me and the people who barely remembered to include me in their group texts. I stared at the gleaming kitchen island already crowded with heirloom casserole dishes and ornate serving platters, each one carrying recipes passed down for generations, while my humble pie screamed of a last-minute grocery run after a long internal debate over whether I should even show up. Uncle David was the first to spot me. His broad, familiar frame ambled across the room with a practiced grin, his hand already rising in that too hard, too loud slap on the shoulder that felt more like a pat from an old colleague than family. Well, look who finally made it, our city girl. Graces us with her presence. He bellowed, his eyes flicking past me before the smile even had a chance to settle. The words were dressed up as a greeting, but beneath the surface they held the same shallow weight as a weather report. Trailing behind him was Brittany Monroe, gliding in with the effortless poise of someone who had been preparing for this spotlight her entire life. Her cream sweater dress hugged her figure just right, her blonde waves cascading in perfectly sculpted curls that likely took an entire morning to achieve. Her gaze slid over me with barely a flicker of acknowledgement before she pivoted gracefully to embrace another cousin, her laugh lilting, calculated empty. Around us, clusters of relatives filled the space, cocooned in their tight-knit groups, their conversations bubbling over in little, self-contained worlds that had no room for me. No one noticed when I slipped my sad little pie onto the crowded dessert table, tucking it between two towering homemade confections that seemed to mock my store-bought offering. No one asked how I'd been. No one spared a chair at their table. I found refuge at the kids' table tucked into a corner as far from the main dining room as one could get without actually sitting outside. 27 years old, yet there I was stirring a plastic straw aimlessly through a sweating glass of sweet tea, praying that it didn't sting. But it did. The truth was I had never truly belonged here. After my parents died in that brutal, senseless accident when I was 15, I had drifted through the foster system, surfacing only on holidays when the sense of duty seemed to outweigh their selective amnesia. They lived their lives untouched, unchanged, as if grief was a private disease they were too immune to catch. I learned early that my presence was an optional accessory to their carefully curated family portrait. Still, some foolish, stubborn part of me kept hoping that maybe this year would be different. That time, maturity, perhaps even shared loss would crack open a space where I could finally fit. But the only reason I kept showing up was Grandpa Walter Monroe. From his seat by the crackling stone fireplace, he watched the circus unfold, wrapped in his burgundy cardigan slacks, creased to perfection. He looked smaller this year, his hands thinner, his frame more fragile, but there was still an undeniable gravity to his presence. Grandpa Walter wasn't a man of many words anymore, but when he spoke, the room always listened. He had been the only one who truly saw me. As a child, when the weight of orphanhood settled on my shoulders, he had been the one to slip extra marshmallows into my cocoa, to quietly pass me worn, beloved books from his personal library. After my parents' funeral, when the rest of the family danced around my grief like it was contagious, he had sat me down, looked me squarely in the eyes, and said, "You are not broken. You are not less. You are ours." That moment had stitched itself into my soul, a beacon I clung to through every lonely Christmas, every birthday spent with no calls, no cards. It was because of him that I kept coming back year after year, despite knowing better. So when Brittany took up the microphone after dinner, launching into the first round of family awards, I forced myself to laugh along. Harmless fun, I told myself as they handed out certificates for loudest laugh and most likely to spill wine. But as the laughter crescendoed, the jokes grew teeth. For the cousin who disappears for months without a single phone call, Rachel Monroe Brittany's voice rang out, syrupy sweet, but sharpened at the edges. A fresh wave of laughter followed. And the award for most mysterious life, since no one actually knows what she even does for work, goes to Rachel Monroe again. The room erupted. My cheeks burned as I forced a brittle smile, my fingers curling into fists beneath the table. The truth was, they didn't know anything about me because they had never cared to ask. I had a job, a career, even bills I paid with my own hard-earned money. But none of that mattered in a family that valued appearances over authenticity, performance over presence. I stole a glance at Grandpa. His face was carved from stone, unreadable, but the air around him felt charged, tense. I told myself to stay composed, to be polite. It was just a joke, after all. Wasn't it always? But somewhere deep within me, beneath years of forced smiles and swallowed retorts, something fragile began to fracture. And even before Brittany raised the glittering microphone for the final blow, I knew this Thanksgiving would not blur into the gray fog of forgettable holidays. No, this one was different. This one was sharpening itself into a memory that would never dull. With a theatrical flourish, Brittany lifted the mic, basking in her moment. And now she announced the ultimate honor, the Monroe family MVP. But before we crown this year's winner, we have a little update. A ripple of curiosity stirred the crowd. Conversations dipped into a murmur. People leaned forward, drawn in by the promise of gossip disguised as ceremony. Even the youngest cousins paused, sensing the shift. Then, with a saccharine smile that belied the venom beneath, Brittany turned to me. "We took a vote," she said brightly, "and Rachel, you're no longer family." The words landed with a quiet, brutal precision. For the briefest moment, silence hung in the air, stretched taut with disbelief. A heartbeat later, it snapped. Laughter exploded louder and more vicious than before. Phones appeared like weapons drawn for battle, gleaming in the dim light, as cousins and aunts jostled to document the spectacle. Brittany Monroe, ever the ringleader, seized her cousin Lauren by the wrist, dragging her into frame with a gleeful, breathless urgency. They angled their camera just so, ensuring my presence remained a void, a deliberate omission. Their smiles gleamed plastic perfect, as if erasing me was the punchline they'd been building toward all night. Across the room, Uncle David flung his arm around another cousin, his booming laugh ricocheting off the walls as he bellowed, "Freedom," as though my exclusion was a liberation, not an execution. A fork clinked sharply against crystal, someone somewhere calling for a toast, while the rest of them whooped and hollered, swept up in the euphoria of collective cruelty. They wore the moment like a badge, their laughter stitching them tighter together, leaving me an afterthought unraveling at the edges. I remained motionless, anchored to my chair, as if by sheer force of will. The cacophony around me blurred, transformed into a piercing metallic roar that reverberated inside my skull. My chest tightened, constricting with every breath until it felt as though my ribs themselves might splinter. Beneath the table, my hands trembled violently in my lap, but I clamped down on the quake, absolutely refusing to let them see the damage. "Get up, walk out, do not give them the satisfaction." With painstaking slowness, I pushed back my chair, the scrape of wood against polished floor somehow deafening. Rising to my feet, I smoothed down my sweater with hands that betrayed me, trembling traitorously as they attempted to restore some illusion of composure. I could feel it, their eyes not bold enough to meet mine, but grazing across me nonetheless. Hot grazing glances waited with the satisfaction of a crowd that had cornered its scapegoat. No one spoke, yet their silence was louder than words, deafening in its indifference. I left the pie behind a half-eaten, pitiful testament to my futile attempt at participation. My boots struck the hardwood with a hollow, deliberate cadence as I moved toward the door, each step heavier than the last, as though the house itself sought to hold me captive in its suffocating embrace. I whispered the lies to myself like a prayer. "It doesn't matter. They were never really my family. You're used to this by now." But the words rang false, thin, and brittle, shattering before they could offer solace. Because the truth, the bitter, aching truth, was that it mattered more than I wanted to admit. Despite everything, some small, foolish part of me had clung to hope. Hope that this year maybe I'd find a place at that table where the seats were always already full. By the time I reached the coat rack, my hands shook so violently I struggled to pull free my jacket. My vision blurred as unshed tears pooled, stinging a betrayal of my carefully constructed armor. I loathed myself for it, for caring, for still giving these people the power to make me feel small. I yanked my coat on with jerking, graceless movements, thrusting one arm through a sleeve as I reached for the doorknob, so close now to escape. And then it came. "Rachel, sit down." The voice was not loud, yet it sliced through the room with surgical precision. Commanding, undeniable. I froze, my fingers suspended midair, breath caught in my throat. For a heartbeat I wondered if I had imagined it, if the desperation in my mind had conjured the voice I needed most to hear. But as I turned slowly, I saw him, Grandpa Walter Monroe, rising from his chair by the hearth, bracing himself against the table's edge as he stood. His movements were deliberate, each shift of weight measured, but there was no mistaking the formidable presence behind them. He was not smiling. He was not amused. His gaze swept the room like a blade, first landing on Brittany, then Uncle David, and then methodically dissecting each face in turn. The house exhaled into a stunned hush. The laughter so raucous moments before choked itself out as though someone had flipped a switch, severing the current. Even the children sensed the seismic shift, their chatter snuffed into stillness. David, desperate to salvage the mood, forced out a thin chuckle. "Dad, it was just a joke. Come on, lighten up. It's Thanksgiving." But Grandpa Walter did not blink. He reached out slow and unyielding and plucked the karaoke microphone from Brittany's startled grasp. His fingers quivered faintly, a testament to time's passage, yet his grip was resolute. "Enough." The single word cracked through the air, a verbal gavel bringing the evening to an abrupt standstill. I remained by the door, half cloaked in my coat heart, battering against my ribcage as though it sought escape of its own. Part of me still wanted to flee, to vanish before the humiliation could deepen, but there was something in Grandpa's eyes that pinned me in place. This was not for show. This was not another public flogging. He was about to say something none of us would forget. He adjusted the microphone with a patience born of absolute control, waiting until the full gravity of his presence saturated the room. In the cavernous silence, every minor sound was magnified: a cough, a fork nervously clinking against porcelain, the rustle of fabric as someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. He looked older than I remembered, fragile almost with the weight of decades etched into the lines of his face, but beneath that there was steel. His spine straightened, his chin lifted, his voice rang out sharp and clear. "You think what you did was clever, that mocking family is some kind of sport to be applauded." Brittany's mouth parted, perhaps to spin another empty excuse, but Grandpa's hand shot up, palm out, silencing her without a word. She clamped her lips shut, her defiance crumbling. Then he turned to me, his voice gentling but losing none of its authority. "Rachel, put that coat down. You are not leaving." For a moment, instinct urged me to run, to bolt out that door and never look back. But beneath the wreckage of my pride, deeper than the sting of their mockery, there was a foundation Grandpa had built stone by stone with every small kindness he had ever shown me. That was the anchor that held me. Slowly, I peeled the coat from my shoulders, draping it over the nearest chair, and stood tall, shoulders squared, breath shallow but steady. Grandpa's gaze returned to the room, his voice gaining strength. "All of you, sit down." Chairs scraped reluctantly against the floor as they obeyed, though not without muttered protests. Even David sank into his seat, red-faced and chastened. Once the murmurs died, Grandpa continued his words, deliberate, each one heavy with purpose. "You voted her out," he said slowly. "You laughed. You tried to strip her of belonging, as if it's yours to grant or take away. But let me remind you, remind every one of you who has the right to call this family their own." His gaze swept the assembly, daring contradiction. "You are not her judges. You are not her gatekeepers." A ripple of unease moved through the room, but no one spoke. "If we're to speak of blood, of legacy, of who carries the true Monroe lineage, then listen well. There is only one person in this room who bears it." His hand extended, pointing without hesitation. "Rachel." The revelation detonated in the space like a silent bomb. Shock rippled through the gathered family expressions, twisted in confusion, denial flickering behind darting glances. Brittany's jaw worked, but no sound emerged. Uncle David leaned forward, his brow furrowed, voice brittle. "Dad, what are you saying?" Grandpa's eyes narrowed, sharp and unrelenting. "You think secrets vanish just because we bury them when you were a baby, David. Your mother and I chose you. We loved you as our own because you were ours in every way that mattered. But by blood, you are not a Monroe." The air seemed to thin, suffocating. The room tilted, vertigo lurching beneath my feet as I clung to the back of a chair for balance. Rachel's father, my son Thomas, was my only biological child. His blood runs in her veins. She is the last true Monroe here tonight. A shuddered silence fell. The same relatives who had laughed at me minutes earlier now studied their plates with an intensity normally reserved for tax audits. Brittany remained rigid, color drained from her face, her tongue silenced for once. The ground beneath us had shifted. The house had not collapsed, but its foundation had cracked wide open, exposing rot long concealed. Grandpa turned to me once more, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer a weapon but a balm. "You belong, Rachel, more than any of them have the right to claim." The words struck deep, wrapping around the hollow spaces inside me, filling them with a weight that was not burden, but truth. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was no longer the invisible one, no longer the afterthought lingering at the edges of family photographs. I wasn't the charity case, the obligatory holiday invitation no one quite wanted to extend. Tonight I stood no existed as the heir to something tangible, something undeniable. Legacy, blood, truth. Grandpa Walter Monroe moved toward me, his steps slow but unwavering, like a man who had carried burdens heavier than time itself. He paid no mind to the hushed whispers or the stunned pale faces that parted before him like a tide unwilling to touch the shore. When he reached me, his hand worn, calloused, and trembling only slightly came to rest on my shoulder. "You stay," he said, his voice quiet, but threaded with an iron resolve that left no room for protest. "This is your family, too. Never let them make you doubt that." I couldn't answer, not with words. The lump in my throat was too large, too jagged. So I simply nodded, feeling the weight of his hand, the steadiness of his presence anchoring me. I returned to my chair with slow, deliberate movements, every muscle resisting the urge to shrink, to disappear. I sat tall, my back straight, my chin lifted, not because they had welcomed me back, not because I sought their permission, but because this seat was mine. Always had been. The silence that spilled over the room was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier. A dense, suffocating fog of guilt, of recognition, of truth unmasked. It wrapped itself around the dining room, clinging to the walls, settling into the folds of tablecloths, making every breath feel labored. No one dared break it. Even the children who had moments ago been a blur of noise and motion sat motionless, wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of what had unfolded. Across the table, the cracked ceramic plate holding the remnants of my half-eaten pumpkin pie became a focal point, a small mundane object rendered monumental in the stillness. I stared at it, at the sticky orange smear hardened into crust, as though it could offer some anchor in the swirl of emotions threatening to drag me under. It was Brittany who moved first. The scrape of her fork hitting porcelain echoed through the quiet like a gunshot. She stood abruptly, arms crossed tight over her chest, her jaw clenched with the kind of righteous indignation that only came from being publicly unmasked. "That's not fair," she said, her voice quivering on the edge of a tantrum. "That's not even real. You're making this up just to defend her." Slowly, Grandpa turned his head toward her, his expression not one of anger, but of bone-deep weariness, like a man tired of teaching the same lesson to students determined not to learn. "You truly believe at my age I'd fabricate lies to protect someone's feelings?" His voice was a scalpel, sharp and precise. "I have never lied to this family. You can ask your father. You can ask your aunts. There are things we chose to keep private, yes, but only because it didn't matter who shared our blood. What mattered is that we chose each other." He shifted his gaze to David, whose hunched posture and downward stare spoke volumes. The blush creeping up his neck, blotchy and raw, was a confession in itself. "It never mattered to me until tonight," Grandpa continued, his voice heavy. "Until I watched every single one of you gang up on a young woman who has done nothing but show up year after year hoping for a sliver of kindness." Brittany's flush deepened, her lips parting as though to argue, but the words, those cruel, careless words she wielded so easily before, failed her now. Grandpa's finger pointed not just at her, but at the whole room, his tone, rising, rattling the silverware, unsettling the very air. "You've confused being loud with being important. You've mistaken popularity for love. You've convinced yourselves that family is a performance of who can laugh the hardest show off the most, belittle the quietest. But family is none of those things. Family is loyalty. It's standing by each other when it's inconvenient, when it's hard. It's showing up not just when the cameras are on, but when no one else is watching." He exhaled then, a long, deliberate breath that seemed to deflate the room itself. "You failed that test tonight." Rachel did not. The finality of his words left no room for rebuttal. The weight of his truth settled over every smirk, every whispered jab, every sidelong glance they had ever thrown my way. Their armor of just joking lay shattered on the floor, their reflections now held up for what they truly were. Grandpa turned back to me, and in his eyes the molten edge of his anger softened, replaced by something warmer, steadfast, unwavering. "You are not just part of this family," he said, voice rich with emotion. "You are its heart." A tremor passed through me. Tears clawed their way to the surface, but I blinked them back with ferocious determination. Not here. Not in front of them. Not like this. Grandpa reached out his hand, finding mine, and in that gentle squeeze was a transference of strength. His palm was dry, the skin paper thin, but the grip was ironclad, rooted in a lifetime of quiet defiance. Around us, the room shifted. Susan dabbed at her eyes, her napkin trembling in her grasp. David rubbed the back of his neck, his face mottled with shame, yet still no words came. The silence was no longer a weapon wielded against me. It had turned on them, exposing their smallness, their pettiness. Brittany sank back into her chair with a graceless thud, pushing her plate away, as if the food itself had soured. The battle was not lost in some grand fiery climax, but in the slow, inexorable realization of their own failings. The landscape of our family had shifted beneath their feet, and they were left scrambling for footing. I sat straighter no longer, the girl shrinking into herself at the kids' table. I met their gazes, those who dared look, and held them, steady, unapologetic. Let them see me now. Let them feel the weight of what they tried to discard. Grandpa leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. You deserved better long before today. The lump in my throat tightened to the point of pain. Words were impossible, but I laced my fingers through his and squeezed, letting my gratitude speak in the quiet press of palms. In that moment, clarity washed over me like sunlight piercing storm clouds. For so long I had bent myself into shapes to fit their narrow definitions, chasing a place that was never truly offered. But I had never needed their approval to belong. My worth had never been contingent on their recognition. Their cruelty did not define my seat at this table. My blood did, my history did, my heart did. And now at last, so did my truth. The evening limped forward after that, hollow and awkward. Apologies floated through the air like brittle leaves, more obligatory than sincere. Brittany kept her eyes fixed anywhere but mine. David attempted half-hearted stories of family escapades, but the laughter never returned. The warmth had seeped out of the house, replaced by a lingering coldness the fireplace could not chase away. The damage had been done, the truth had been spoken, and sometimes truth was all you needed to set yourself free. After dinner, the usual post-feast chaos was conspicuously absent. Instead of the familiar hustle of dishes, clattering football debates, and frenzied Black Friday plans, there was only a tense quiet as people shuffled aimlessly, muttering excuses for early departures. I collected plates without being asked. No one stopped me. No one offered to help. I moved among them like a ghost, but this time the haunting was not mine to bear. In the kitchen, I scrubbed dishes with unnecessary vigor, the warm water and cheap soap suds giving my restless hands purpose. Behind me, soft footsteps approached. Rachel, Grandpa said gently, leaning on his cane, his eyes crinkling with something that might have been pride. You don't have to clean up their mess. I smiled, then a small, genuine smile that reached further than any polite grin had before. I know, I said softly. I just needed a minute. He nodded, understanding in every line of his face. With a soft grunt, he shuffled over, dragging a chair to the counter's edge, lowering himself carefully into it. I meant every word tonight, he said after a pause, voice firm despite its age. I'd say it again tomorrow, and the day after that if you made me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just my grandfather, but the quiet warrior who had always fought for me whether I noticed or not. He hadn't just defended me tonight. He had given me something far more precious, permission. Permission to stop chasing love from those too small-hearted to give it. Permission to exist without explanation. Permission to be exactly who I was. Thank you, I said, my voice rough but sure. His smile deepened, folding into the familiar creases I had memorized as a child. You've always been more family than the lot of them combined. You stayed kind. You stayed strong. That matters more than blood. Though it seems you had both. Setting down the final plate, I slid into the chair beside him. The silence that settled between us was not empty. It was full of understanding of history, of quiet, unwavering love. It was some time later when Uncle David Monroe wandered into the kitchen, his broad frame, slightly hunched hands buried deep in his worn jeans pockets, as if he were bracing against an internal cold front. His face was flushed, not with the cheer of too many beers, but with something rawer. Embarrassment, maybe even shame. He paused in the doorway, opening his mouth as though words were lining up, ready to spill. But they didn't. Instead, his lips pressed together, the apology stalled reluctant, before finally forcing its way out. Rachel, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have. It was stupid. The confession hung in the air between us, brittle and half-formed like a paper crane that had crumpled mid-fold. I regarded him for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with the clarity of someone who had already laid that burden down long before it was offered back. I know, I said simply. There was no venom, no grand gesture of forgiveness, just fact. He nodded once awkwardly, the flush creeping up his neck, and without waiting for absolution, he turned and shuffled away the weight of his own misstep, heavier than anything I could have added. From the corner of the kitchen, a soft chuckle broke the tension. You handled that better than I would have, Grandpa Walter said, his voice curling around the edges with quiet amusement. I smiled, then a real smile devoid of the bitterness that had once seemed fused to my bones. The truth was simple. I had forgiven them long before tonight, long before the cruelty of their jokes, long before the revelation of bloodlines and truths. Not because they had earned it. No forgiveness had been a gift I had given myself away to release the weight of their thoughtless wounds, to free myself from the anchors they had long since forgotten they'd attached to me. I had spent too many years, too many moments in rooms like this one, twisting myself into smaller, quieter versions of who I was, all in the name of being loved, by people who were never going to do the work of loving me back. That chapter was closed. I was done writing apologies for my own existence. As the night stumbled toward its end, I helped Grandpa into his coat, guiding his frail frame carefully matching my steps to his deliberate pace. The cold greeted us as we stepped outside, crisp and unapologetic, biting at my cheeks and stealing my breath for a heartbeat. Above us, the stars unfurled across the night sky scattered diamonds against a velvet expanse, so achingly vast and silent compared to the suffocating noise of the evening's earlier events. At the edge of the driveway, Grandpa paused, turning toward me with a small, knowing smile. "You're going to be just fine, Rachel," he said, the words soft but certain. "Better than fine." I wrapped my arms around him gently, mindful of his frailty, yet needing the solidity of his presence all the same. His embrace was thin, but steady, his palm patting my back with that familiar grounding rhythm. "I love you," I whispered, the words catching in my throat like a secret finally spoken aloud. "I love you too, kiddo," he replied, and in those few syllables was a lifetime of every unspoken reassurance I had ever needed. Later, in the quiet cocoon of my car, I sat with my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching my breath fog up the windshield in slow, ghostly tendrils. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by that gnawing ache, the bitter loneliness that used to trail behind me like an unwelcome shadow after every family gathering. I felt lighter, stronger, as though something inside me had shifted, snapped free from the invisible chains I had worn for so long. Belonging, I realized, had never been theirs to grant. It was not a seat at their table, not an invitation, not a title bestowed by a vote. It had always been inside me, waiting quietly, patiently, for me to recognize its presence and claim it as my own. As I drove away from the lake house, its windows glowing dimly in my rearview mirror, I let Grandpa's words settle into the fabric of my being. Family is not defined by who laughs when you stumble, but by who kneels beside you when you cannot stand. It is forged not in shared blood, but in steadfast presence, in loyalty, in love that shows up even when it's inconvenient. That night, I stopped waiting for an invitation to someone else's table. I started building my own. And in that sacred space, I envisioned, though still an idea not yet formed in bricks and mortar, I vowed that every seat would be offered freely. No one would ever have to question if they belonged. No one would ever wonder if they were wanted, because they would know.